Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, the esteemed scholar, he says that Muslims in the West are between one of three options. One being total assimilation, the other being total isolation, and the third being a calculated integration. So total assimilation being where Muslims essentially lose all of what makes up their identity as individuals in a community. And he would argue, as I understand, as I would argue, that that's a blameworthy extreme. Total isolation being where the Muslim community basically insulates itself from the broader community, develops isolated micro-communities in which there's not a bidirectional process with the broader community. The third, which he argues is the intelligent approach, and the one that I would tend to agree with, although this needs some unpackaging, is a calculated integration. And that's a loaded word, because integration itself, in some people's mind, may mean the same as assimilation. That if we're going to integrate, then that means we're going to assimilate. But the idea that we have begun saying that we want to assimilate is problematic, because there's all kind of things left out about the realities of the dominant culture and what we even mean when we say the dominant culture, and what house is it that we're trying to make our way into, what's going on in that house, and what does that have to do with the sustainability, the longevity of our existence as a religious community. See, it's really like what we've got to do is develop more complex thinking, and we've got to get back to sophistication and maturity as a community when it comes to the stuff of cultural production. Because if we're not producing our own culture, if we're not making culture and self-validating, self-authenticating, then we will necessarily be controlled by those who otherize us by saying you are this or you are that. So if we think of ourselves as a victimized, religious minority community that is powerless and that, has no place at the table, then that's how we're going to behave, and ultimately that's what we will produce. We will produce the results of a defeatist people. And like they say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So if we're not going to be at the table discussing the realities of our cultural experience as a community in this society, our political stance vis-a-vis things that are happening politically, our economic presence in this country, et cetera, or in the world, then we're just letting other people define that for us. And so that's not calculated. I really believe, especially for young people, it's important that we provide a way for people to be producers of culture. That we're the subjects when it comes to the stuff of understanding and expressing and augmenting culture and agitating culture. We're not just passive objects. In other words, somebody wants to twerk. The Muslims should automatically be like, yo, that's super lame. Even before getting into, that's really disgraceful. Even before getting to, that's blatantly haram. A Muslim should not want to have anything to do with something that is produced by anybody that is A, impermissible, B, not classy, C, that is shameful. A Muslim should just be like, oh yeah, that's not what we do. So would we be like, oh, how do we come up with the Muslim version of the twerk? And we'll call it the mwerk. No, we don't want to be like them. And when we say them, we don't mean non-Muslims or Americans. We mean people that are doing things that are not respecting American culture. They're not respecting humanity. They're not respecting basic human dignity. Dr. Jackson, Allah preserve him, talks about in Islam and the Black American, he talks about the idea that as American Muslims gain agency in the tradition of Islam and what he calls the Sunni super tradition, that is to say, the normative tradition of Sunni Islam, that it will act as an accelerator and as a brake. In other words, if we understand Islam correctly, it will accelerate the process of cultural production, but it will also be the thing that makes us say, well, slow down a minute. Right? Going a little bit too far. So does Islam say to us, like, nah, man, y'all shouldn't be hip. Y'all shouldn't be cool. Y'all shouldn't be, contemporary. Y'all need to be old-fashioned and lame. In order to be authentically Muslim, you need to be foreign, old-fashioned, and lame. Hasha lillahi ta'ala. Far be it from God that the truth would say that in order to be spiritually authentic, you have to be old-fashioned and awkward and weird. That's the most asinine thing I've ever heard in my life. Imam Malik, imagine that before he would even narrate a hadith, Imam Malik would go bathe and put on his finest clothes and put on his turban and perfume himself and burn aloes wood and sit on a chair before he'd even mention a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Islam should encourage us to be people who do things that are culturally relevant. It should encourage us to do things that are socially relevant. It should encourage us to do things that they stick with people. Like, oh, that I'm vibing with that. I like that. I'm not mad at that. But it also will tell us, like, we have this thing called the sacred law. And so if we're going to do that, let's not do things that go outside of the sacred law. So, like, can you do things that are, like, super, super cool and even really edgy and not break the rules at all? I believe you can.